Welcome, Rich Carroll here from Home Team Inspections, and we're proud to be a presenting sponsor for today's session on waterfront property with Erin Christy. Erin Christy is an associate attorney with Shumaker, Loop, and Kendrick. Her principal areas of practice are residential and commercial real estate transactions, zoning and land use law. She has represented clients in a wide range of transactional real estate matters, including representing individuals and businesses in acquisition, development, leasing, and the sale of residential and commercial properties. Erin's land use and zoning practice also encompasses representing landowners in connection with rezonings, variances, special exceptions, and conditional use approvals. She is a frequent speaker on waterfront property issues and, as a native Sarasotan, enjoys helping families make Sarasota their home through the purchase of their first home, their vacation home, or their forever home. Erin serves on the Realtor Attorney Joint Committee for Realtor Association of Sarasota Manatee. She is also a member of the Executive Council for the Real Property, Probate, and Trust Law section of the Florida Bar, and the immediate past president of the Young Lawyers Division of the Sarasota County Bar Association. Erin also serves on the board for the Ringling College Library Association and is a member of its Town Hall Lecture Series Committee. When Erin is not at the office, she enjoys hosting friends under the banyan tree in her backyard, mixing up old fashions and relaxing with her husband, daughter, and 2 French bulldogs. Please welcome Erin Christy.
Good morning, everyone. I am excited to be here today. And I think you'll see just a little bit, there is a chat screen. So as you have questions, please feel free to put them there. And I am keeping an eye on those. So no matter how many times I give this presentation, I'm always nervous. There is so much to know about waterfront property. So our goal today is to make sure that you can identify issues as they relate to waterfront property and assist customers considering purchases, understand the resources that are available to customers to address issues related to waterfront property, and then identify when professional consultants should be brought into the conversation. Waterfront property is so unique. No two are the same. And so we're going to try to touch on as much as possible. And of course, my chat box kind of comes in and out. So I will probably do more addressing of questions at the end via Q&A, but we'll certainly try to get to everyone. My contact information is here. echristy@shumaker.com is my email address, and the 941-364-2732 is my direct dial. I love questions, love working with realtors. So, please feel free to reach out if a question doesn't get answered here today. So first, we're going to talk about flood zones and FEMA and what it is and why it matters. So FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Association, which is responsible for the National Flood Insurance Program that was established in 1968. So this flood insurance program was created to address...
Erin?
Yes.
Let's just make sure you're sharing your PowerPoint when you're ready.
That I'm sharing it?
Sharing your screen?
Oh, I think I am sharing my screen.
It's not showing it, so...
I don't even have the option to... One second, guys. We're having a problem sharing my screen. Cassidy, I can't even get to the...
Okay. Give us just a second, guys. We're just working on the PowerPoint right now. Erin, do you see our videos on the screen?
I see my video, yeah.
Okay, at the very bottom, does it give you the option to share screen? The bright green button?
Nope. Okay, here we go. How about now, everybody? I think that's, is it sharing?
Yep, you're on the FEMA slide now, so you're all good.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that, guys. So quick going back, so that you have my information there if you want to write it down. This is my email address and my phone number should questions come up after the fact. and we'll keep going forward. What would it be without a little glitch this morning? Okay, so moving forward, the flood insurance program was put into place to address floods concerning flood-prone areas and the inability of private insurance industry to sell affordable flood insurance. And so the National Flood Insurance Program partners with communities to provide federally subsidized flood insurance, and the community in turn adopts certain regulations and flood zone management standards for flood-prone areas so that they're constructed to resist flood damage. So in other words, FEMA agrees to make flood insurance available and affordable, and the community agrees to adopt floodplain management ordinance and then actually enforce those regulations. So oftentimes people ask, how do we determine whether our property is in a flood zone or not? You can determine that by going to the FEMA website. Right here is what you would enter in the hyperlink, and then it'll pull up this page, and you enter the address of the property that you're looking at here. So I have entered in 1400 Siesta Drive. And this is what pulled up. This red dot here is where our property is, and you can see that it is in zone AE. So these maps in Sarasota County were recently done in 2016. Updates are underway. Maybe you've heard that in both Sarasota and Manatee County. In fact, even Lee County has got theirs underway. I did speak with the county last week as I was working with property here in the city of Sarasota, because those have not been adopted yet. And when asked about the delay, we cannot avoid COVID. And actually, because FEMA is so involved with COVID, the actual adoption of the new flood maps has been delayed a little bit. So while you can find proposed ones out there, these ones from 2016 are still what is in effect. So what we're looking for when it comes to FEMA, flood insurance, things that we'll get into like the 50% rule soon, and what can be done with property in a flood zone, are really flood zone VE, you see one here, and flood zone AE. These are what are called special flood hazard zones, and really require flood insurance where there is a loan on the property. Flood zone V is considered higher hazard. So that is subject to velocity hazard, like wave action and things like that. AE, keep in mind, look how far in this flood zone goes. You do not have to be on the water to be in a flood zone. So make sure you're paying attention, even out in the eastern part of our counties, Manatee County, Sarasota County. We do have the Myakka River there. There are flood zones there. So it's important to check whether or not you're in a flood zone, regardless of whether you're right on property or not. So like I said, if you have a loan and you're in a zone A or a zone V, flood insurance will be required by the lender. It will be optional in other zones and certainly more affordable in other zones. And you'd be able to build on grade there. So what we're going to talk about next is the 50% rule that is under FEMA, and when those are in play. And so that is in play for anything in zone A or zone V, regardless of whether or not you have a loan on the property. The first thing you want to understand is that, we talked about FEMA and when it came into play. So FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program came into play in the late 60s. And that meant that local municipalities were adapting their floodplain management ordinance sometime in the mid 70s. And so what you are looking for is whether or not your structure is subject to the 50% rule and the substantial improvement rule. So if your property was built prior to 1970, chances are you are considered legally non-conforming, and any improvements that are below base flood elevation are permitted to stay. If you were built after the 1970s, it's likely the structure is subject to these FEMA regulations we'll discuss, and the following will be considered. So what is BFE? BFE is the base flood elevation, and it's the requirement that your structure be built above a certain elevation above sea level in order to limit the damage that may happen. And that's what makes it available for flood insurance, and it's what makes it, in line with what our local municipality requires for all buildings. The elevation certificate that you get, maybe you've heard that if you're dealing in waterfront property, if you haven't dealt much with waterfront property, an elevation certificate will tell you what the bottom of your ground level floor is elevated to, and a surveyor can give you that. So if you are getting a survey, usually it's an extra $100 to $200 to get your own elevation certificate. Keep in mind, I told you those flood zones were updated in 2016. If a buyer or a seller, I'm sorry, provides an elevation certificate to you, and it's older than 2016, it could be outdated. So we always recommend that a buyer pay that extra money and get their own elevation certificate done to determine what the required base flood elevation is for the property and whether or not their property meets it. It's important to point out that we have seen fraud in flood elevation certificates. And so if you get a flood elevation certificate and it looks like the elevation of your property has been handwritten in or typewritten in, something looks a little off, that should be a red flag to you, because it could be that the property owner is trying to deceive you to make you think, oh, this is not a property that will require flood insurance. This is not a property where I will be limited on what I can do with it. So just really recommend that your customers pay the extra money to get their own flood elevation certificate. Many lenders, if there is a loan involved, will require it anyway, because so many maps are being updated and have been updated recently. So here are things to look for. We'll look at the PowerPoint now. I think oftentimes you'll hear about legally non-conforming space or illegally non-conforming space and what that means. So here's an example of a listing out on one of the barrier islands that would have been in a flood zone. And you can see that it's really built out here. There's a kitchenette, there's a bathroom, you've got electrical wires, kind of midway through the wall here. And so if there is anything other than parking, storage, and access to the main home, you need to consider whether or not that space was legally built. Appliances, floor coverings other than outdoor tile, a washer and dryer down on this ground level, especially out on barrier islands, electrical outlets that are below, 10 to 14 feet. Oftentimes you'll see them up at the top of the wall if it is conforming. Those are all red flags that this might be non-conforming space. So if you see this, you need to ask yourself, when was this structure built? And more importantly, when were these improvements below base flood elevation built? If they were built before 1970, even if they're being updated, so maybe a kitchenette or a bathroom were updated since then, so long as they were legally conforming when they were there, chances are you're probably fine. But if they were built after the 1970s, it could be a red flag that this is legally non-conforming space, was done without a permit, the city, the county might not know about it, and your buyer's really taking a risk that that property could be at risk for them to have to fix the issue if it is discovered. So what does that mean for a buyer, and why is this important for you to just kind of have some basic walking around knowledge? If the municipality discovers that there is illegal non-conforming space, whether your buyer built the improvements or not, the owner will have to pay to remove the improvements and return the space to storage area. So if it's discovered after the fact, oftentimes this will happen is somebody will buy property, it's got something that looks like a mother-in-law suite like this in it, and they think, hey, I can rent that out, I'll post it on Airbnb, I'll post it on VRBO. The city and the county are looking at those, and trying to determine if there is, non-conforming space there, because it puts our area at risk to not be eligible for FEMA and the insurance that comes with that. So that is one of the ways that the county's discovering it. Another way is if buyer buys the house and they want to put a new roof on, and the city or county comes out to inspect the roof and do the permit, they could find that non-conforming space. So it could come up even in situations where the municipality is nowhere near the downstairs area, the base, the ground floor area. So just something to bring up that it could be discovered, and it would be, once your buyer has closed, theirs to pay to fix. So what do you do? To avoid this, if you see space like this, ask the seller for permits for the ground level improvements. If they've done them, they should have permits. If they look new, there should be some permits involved. If not, sometimes you need to go to the actual municipality if they were older, and see if you can dig them up and find them in their files. That can be really hard to do because files aren't usually saved that long. So if you can't find any permits for the ground level improvements, ask for written determination from the local government official, the building official, that the ground level improvements are actually legal. If the space is illegal and you find that out during your due diligence period of the contract, some things you might want to consider is reducing the purchase price to take care of the risk that might be there in the cost of ripping it out, or the lack of value there. Or potentially terminate the contract if your buyer does not want to take on that risk. So those are kind of two big items that you might want to consider in getting into a contract like this. Oftentimes you have a cash buyer, they're willing to take that risk. I think just making sure that you've got counsel involved to explain to them what that risk really could entail is important. So next, what we're going to talk about is the 50% rule. So for properties within a special flood hazard zone, so again, we talked about those, the A and the V, the cost of what is, and this is a defined term, substantial improvements, or the cost, to repair or update a structure, it cannot exceed 50% of the market value of the building if any part of that building is below base flood elevation. So here's an example here. Here's a house built up and the base flood elevation line is here. Any improvements that you wanted to do on this structure would be limited to 50% of the value of the structure, and only the structure. So even if somebody paid $1 million on a closing contract, but the structure was only valued at $300,000, then somebody would be limited to $150,000 of updates and repairs. Unless, of course, they took the entire structure and raised it above the base flood elevation, and then they can do whatever they want. So this is really just if any part of the property is below base flood elevation. This really comes into play, and something to consider from the buying and selling aspect is if you've got somebody kind of looking for a bargain waterfront property, like a bargain waterfront property, and they say, that's okay. Like everything needs to be touched. It needs a new kitchen. It needs a new bathroom. I probably want to put in new windows. It needs new flooring. And it is in a flood zone and old and below the base flood elevation. Keep in mind that it is really going to be limited how much the owner, once they own the property, can do based on that very limited assessed value of the property. And so there are some workarounds to that. I know some of you probably remember a time when projects could be completed in phased improvements, and kind of to work around this 50% rule. So they would do 2 bathrooms and half of the kitchen, close out the permits, and then go get new permit, reassess the property and get new permits. FEMA's on to us on that one, and they really encourage local officials to determine whether those consecutive permits and those applications are all relative to the same property improvement. And officials do have the discretion to determine if those consecutive permits should all be considered one and the same, or if they can actually be divided up. so that you can kind of spread it out. So maybe you update 3 bathrooms and put in new flooring, close out all those permits, reassess the property so that it's worth more now that it's been updated, and then you have more money to work with to do the kitchen. I will say that locally, the city especially is pretty good at working with buyers on doing that. When you have a knowledgeable contractor, they really work well with the city and can help you work through that. But keep in mind, even at that point, it can be a little bit limited depending on how many upgrades your buyer is looking at doing. So that is kind of FEMA, the 50% rule in a nutshell. I'm sure there will be questions on that. I will answer as many of them as I can at the end, and then also point you in the right direction if there are follow-up questions that I cannot answer, because we have a lot more to get to for waterfront property. One thing that you want to understand are adjacent waters. And what that means is, okay, you have this parcel here and you're going to buy it. And you see this water here and you think, all right, I've got access to the water. That's great. What you really need to make sure is that you do have rights to use that water. It may be that submerged land is privately owned. Here's a good example. This is where the quay used to be and where all of the development's happening on that Bayfront project. And these are the water parcels here. You'll see here that this parcel was owned by somebody else, not by the upland owner, but completely separate. Where you have that, you need to help your buyer, not you. You need to find an advisor to help you understand what you can do with and over that waterfront parcel, and make sure that you can do what you want to do with it. So, do you have a right to build a dock over it? Do you have a right to use it? Is there an easement in place? So I will say this doesn't happen all that frequently. You'll see it happen more so down on like Minnesota Key and Casey Key some. You'll see this outward parcel that might not be owned by the upland owner, but instead by like a neighbor. And it's just really something to be paying attention to and understanding what it is your customer wants to do with the property, and make sure they have the rights to do it without needing to jump through a lot of hoops. Oftentimes, the waterfront property is state-owned. And so what that means is you're really just dealing with a lot more government red tape if there are things that you want to do with the property, such as build a new dock. You'll be dealing not only with the city or the county, the local municipality, but you'll also be dealing with DEP permits, Army of Corps engineers, and in the event that you are in a community association of some sort, oftentimes you'll be dealing with deed restrictions. So just keep in mind that just because the water is attached to the property, there's still more due diligence to be done as to what you can actually do with the water that abuts the property. One question we get a lot are mangroves. As we all know, mangroves are protected. And so we'll get asked, this happens a lot with listings too, as we'll maybe represent a seller and they want to know, what can I do to get this property kind of up and ready to be photographed and on the market, and what do I do as I continue to carry it forward? So Sarasota County has taken over mangrove trimming. Most other municipalities or other counties defer to the state, but Sarasota is very protective of their mangroves, and they've got great people on staff to help with that. And so they've really continued to control that. So one thing you need to understand as far as whether or not you can trim mangroves and what you can do are that there are only certain things or times that an owner themselves can trim mangroves. So first of all, they have to the mangroves must actually be on the owner's property in order for them to trim them. Sometimes, like in this picture, you might see mangroves that are out this way, they're blocking some of the dock, and somebody wants to trim them. If the mangroves are not actually, if they're out beyond what is called the mean high water line, those are not the upland owners to trim, and they cannot trim them. Nothing to be done about that. These ones, let's just assume that they are on the owner's property. Great. Then they at least know that they have the authority to trim them, subject to a couple of other things. The mangroves must have a depth of 50 feet or less. So from the most waterward edge of the mangrove to the most landward. Again, this happens, this picture does not depict this, but these really long mangrove beds that extend out along the dock, you're really limited on what you can do there, and you need to get a professional in. Same goes with the shoreline. So if you've got more than 150 feet of shoreline covered by mangroves, you're limited in how much you can trim yourself. So they can only be trimmed 65% of the total length of the mangrove shoreline, and then you have to wait and do the other 65% the following years. Mangroves have to be somewhat mature before you're allowed to trim them back. So they have to be at least 6 feet in height. That said, they cannot be taller than 16 feet in height, or else they just have to be trimmed in phases. And then of course, no herbicides can be used on the mangroves. If you do not meet these very particular parameters as an owner, then you must have a professional trimmer come in. Honestly, it is so specific, and the fines can be so high that it is recommended to have a professional trimmer come in if you are going to touch mangroves. The county has these recommended professional mangrove trimmers. It's available on the county site, but I give them here to you too for easy access as far as, you know, who you might want to call to get a recommendation. This is really important for sellers who, you know, have this waterfront property that might sit on the market a little bit longer and vacant because they, you know, have a smaller pool of buyers. So really keep, as you're getting ready to help somebody list a property, keep in mind that there's some upkeep involved. And if they want to make sure that the mangroves aren't getting overgrown, they have a plan to keep them trimmed and be able to trim them within the parameters before they get overgrown. Similarly, if you know somebody's thinking about putting something on the market, you might want to start the mangrove trimming very early on if they've got mangroves that are out of control, because you can only take out a certain amount of time at a time. One thing I get asked a lot in this presentation is the ability to cut out, you know, window panes in the middle of a mangrove. All of that should be approved by the county before you do any of it. There are some good examples of pruning of mangroves where it allows the sight line, but you just don't want to put the property at risk of suffering a code enforcement violation or something that can't be fixed that carries with it hefty fines. The next question that comes up a lot with property owners looking to buy property are docks. And one thing that, you know, we see happen sometimes is that you see a structure like this out over the property, and the buyer assumes, great, I've got a dock, I can put my boat there, it's no problem. So first, let's talk about the difference between a pier and a dock. So a pier is a structure that goes over water, which is primarily used for fishing, swimming, or launching non-motorized vehicles, such as canoes and kayaks. Some things that you usually will see on a pier, again, this is not determinative, but just more likely, are handrails. No real like access into the water here. Whereas the dock is a structure that's usually got pilings, a little more supports, decking. It extends out over the water, and it's used to secure a boat and vessels, oftentimes motorized. So these are two different things. And just because you see a structure out over the water, you really want to understand, and you want your buyer to understand what is permitted there and what can they do with that structure. So as you're doing your due diligence, one thing to ask the seller is, hey, you know, was this permitted? And was it done in accordance with the approved plans? So ask for the permits. If the seller can't find them, if maybe they didn't ask for them during due diligence and they aren't the ones who built it, go to the city, go to the county. It is likely that they have something on hand that would be the permit for the dock or the fishing pier. And then also ask, you know, did you alter it as a seller? Have you done anything to change this that might make it no longer fit the regulations? One issue that I had come up last year was there was a dock. The dock was permitted, but the seller had extended the dock unpermitted to allow for a larger boat. And so while it looked like you could moor a 35-foot boat there, when we actually pulled the permit, they could only moor a 25-foot boat there. And and you know, for me, it sounds great. I would happily moor a 25-foot boat on my waterfront property. But keep in mind, people have very specific needs, very specific boats that they already have or want to have. They're moving to Florida for that deep sea fishing lifestyle, something like that. You really want to make sure that whatever their needs are, they're doing the due diligence to make sure that their boat can go there. Along those lines are whether or not the boat, okay, so it was long enough, but can you actually, is it deep enough? Are there adequate water depths here around the dock that allow them to put the boat that they want in the water? So a boat draft, meaning the part of the boat that, you know, kind of goes in the water, under the water, must be at least 1 foot above any seagrasses. So if there are seagrasses around, the boat draft must be 1 foot above those. There are seagrasses in more places than you may even think about, even if they're small. One that I worked on was in, you know, just down kind of off of Red Rock. And this is the upland property here. It's hard to see. These surveys get very detailed. And then this is the water here. And there are seagrasses all in here. And so you need to have 1 foot of clearance from the bottom of the boat to the top of the seagrass around the mooring area. So here, and then a channel all the way out to navigable waterways. And so if you have somebody who's got a fishing boat that has a lot of draft, you will probably want to recommend to them that they get a bathymetric survey. A bathymetric survey, there are a number of surveyors in town who do them. This one was done by Red Stake. There are other surveyors that do it. What they do is they go out and they get in the water and they take these poles and they put them down in the water and they tell you the water depth. They'll tell you the water depth all around the mooring area, and they'll help you find the navigable channel or the channel out into navigable waterway. You know, in this situation, we found out, and I don't think I have it zoomed in here, and I apologize for that. Oh, no, I do. Okay. So we found out that while there was some area that would allow for our boat to fit a very small draft boat, we would not be able to have a full fishing boat in there, because if the draft of the boat was 3 feet, and this number here is 2.4, you don't have enough area there to have enough depth there to have 1 foot between the top of the seagrasses and the bottom of the boat. So just really important to understand. I would say that I have learned that most boating salespeople, most people who own a boat, the description of the boat will explain what the draft is. And so that is, you know, one of those things to just ask, do you have a boat in mind? Let's make sure that the dock that's there can hold it. And if not, are you willing to have another one? Here, it was so shallow once you took into account the seagrasses that you essentially could have had a kayak, and that was it. So while you had this beautiful view from this dock, it looked in photos like you could have just such great water access. It turned out that having a boat there was almost impossible. And it was a deal breaker for our clients. If there are no seagrasses, then do whatever you want. As long as your boat doesn't hit the bottom, you'll be okay. But you know, seagrasses are very prevalent. You will oftentimes see recorded in the title work, if this issue has already been addressed or a dock is more recent, a restrictive covenant recorded against the property that will tell you the draft of a vessel using the dock. So sometimes this due diligence has already been done for you. Oftentimes we've found that unless the dock's pretty new, it's not been done. A lot of people ask how bathymetric survey is spelled. It's BATHYMETRIC. Okay. So if a dock does not already exist on your property and you want one in the county, keep in mind that it will require a minor work permit. And the joke is there's nothing minor about it. It's a pretty big deal. You're going to get your, dock contractor involved, oftentimes an environmental engineer. I would say the lawyers are less involved at this stage unless something comes up that needs interpretation. But, we have great local companies that help with that. You're going to have to go through the same questions as above. Is a dock allowed here? Do I have the water depth to put a vessel in? What kind of restrictive covenant is going to be required, and what boat draft is going to be limited here. In addition to that, with a new dock, sorry, I'm trying to get to a pretty picture for you guys. So you have something pretty to look at. So with a new dock, keep in mind that there will also be kind of neighbor to neighbor restrictions on it. So if you are putting in a new dock on a property and that dock is going to be within 25 feet of your neighboring property line, either way, you are probably going to need your neighbor to consent, put that in writing, and it's going to have to be recorded in the public records. So if you've only got, 75 feet of waterfront, chances are, unless you're putting it right in the middle of the property, one of the neighbors is going to have to consent. And certainly if you only have 50 feet of waterfront, you're probably going to need both neighbors to consent. So just something to keep in mind, being really friendly as you're looking at property, getting to know the neighbors can be helpful. The other question, we talked about who owns the land. If that land is owned by a neighboring property, you might need an easement to build a dock over it. There could be private deed restrictions from a local association, like your homeowners association, that limits what you can do with a dock. So just a lot of due diligence to be done on what can be built on property if there isn't already one there. So don't assume that just because there's a house and you're looking at water in the backyard, that means that there can be a dock there. There are beautiful, very expensive properties, for example, on Siesta Key, on Big Pass, that you cannot put a dock there. It is restricted. There may be a house next to you that it was grandfathered in. That dock has been there since the 50s, and they kept it up, and so it's grandfathered in, but that does not mean that you're going to be able to build a new one. So really keep in mind that just because you see a property, you got a dock to your neighbor on the left, dock with your neighbor on the right, that does not mean that you are going to be able to have one. So really important to understand that. We're going to get into some things that you probably hear about with waterfront property. And you're kind of like, what are they? How are they different? So in all of Florida, we have what's called the Coastal Construction Control Line. In this picture, that is the bright green line here. And what this is basically a line. Let's see if I have a slide that actually tells us. It is a line done by the state of Florida that pretty much says, construction beyond this will require special permitting from the state if you're going to build here or rebuild here. And that has to be disclosed in the contract. So I'm sure you have seen this rider, which is the Coastal Construction Control Line, that is required if the property is located waterward of that line. So in this case, it'd be, these things along Beach Road here are all seaward of the Coastal Construction Control Line. As of July 1st, 2006, the Florida law requires a seller to provide a buyer with that disclosure. So Rider N has the verbatim language that's needed. If for some reason the disclosure is forgotten, it's not given, the contract is still enforceable. The issue here is that there could be ramifications for a broker or an agent who had actual knowledge that the property was located in the area that required the disclosure, and there could be a violation of misrepresentation or concealment. So really pay attention. Find out if your property is seaward of the Coastal Construction Control Line. This is for single family residences, and make sure that that disclosure is on there if you are listing property. If you are helping a buyer buy property, just ask that it's attached, just to kind of keep everything on the up and up. And so you can say, like, look, the buyer knew that it was seaward of the Coastal Construction Control Line. There is another line in Sarasota County specifically, I'll show you this on this one, it's the blue line. So in Sarasota County, this does not apply in the city, it doesn't apply in Manatee. There is a line here called the Gulf Beach setback line. So it's the blue one. The Gulf Beach setback line says that, look, improvements that are made seaward or waterward of the Gulf Beach setback line need a variance from the county. Anybody who's been through a variance not on the water knows that they can be a big deal. Double, triple it once you're on the water. So there are a couple of exceptions of things that you can do with property and improvements that can be made without a variance. They're small. You can do catwalks or stairs or decks that are no larger than 144 square feet. So you can do that without a variance. You can put down crushed shell or something, you know, for a driveway, so long as you're not impacting vegetative and native habitats. You can reconfigure an existing driveway or parking area, or you can demolish things. Of course, they'll let you, you know, get rid of any improvements that are seaward of the Gulf Beach setback line. Anything else? You want to put in a pool, you want to create a slightly larger deck, you want to add a bedroom, you want to rip down a whole house, right, and build new on it so that the whole house meets the FEMA regulations that we talked about, you are going to need a variance. And the variance process here is in depth. The application fee alone, so just to apply to get one, is $3,000. And there are several things that you need for a Gulf Beach variance that you will need to get licensed professionals involved. The county is going to require that you have plans in place, so you'll need an architect showing the plans. They are going to require a topographic survey showing vegetation, any sort of native habitats, things like that, as well as very specific types of surveys that show cross-sectionals of the building and the improvement. So these are really detailed drawings. We have great people locally who can help with that. But it is not an easy or quick process. The process can take 4 to 6 months once you even have a design in place. So take out the planning and the architecture part, you still have 4 to 6 months once a design has been put in place. Ones that I have worked on have cost, you know, especially where we're adding on to a house with substantial square footage or building a new house, upwards of $50,000 for the owner by the time you had the legal fees, the actual attendance at the hearing, reviewing the survey and making sure everything on the application was in place. Meeting with neighbors, it's really important to have neighbors involved in the process because they can show up to the Sarasota County hearing and oppose it. And so you really want to make sure that you're meeting with neighbors early on. So I say this because while this could be an entire class in and of itself, and especially just a class to lawyers on how it's done, it's not an easy undertaking. And so if you've got somebody looking for property that is waterfront, beachfront, and they want to, you know, tear down kind of like a scraper and build anew, they need to understand that even if money is no object, time, it really takes a substantial amount of time from start to finish, and some playing nice with your neighbors. So that is one. I rarely have time to get to this in my presentation, so I was glad that we were able to cover that. I want to pull up the chat box. This is an example, actually, of just one of the surveys that was required for a Gulf Beach setback variance, where we were showing where we were going to add on to property, what was being moved. So it is a very, very detailed process. I am going to leave this up and of course can send it to anybody who wants it or needs it. So many times that so many issues that we addressed in this presentation, we talk about, you know, get with your local municipality, figure out what their rules are. This is who you want to contact. I have Sarasota County, City of Sarasota, Manatee County, Charlotte County. You know, your waterfront questions might be different than your FEMA questions. So I've outlined those here. And I will keep that up while I pull up the chat box. Jesse taught me how to do this, I think. So I will see if I can figure it out. Well, I am not able to find my chat box. Here we go. I see them now. Okay. I can absolutely, I think there's a couple of questions about whether we can send the PowerPoint. I can certainly send this PowerPoint out so that everybody has it easily, or I will ask somebody at Racing to do it since they should have all of the participants. And I think that's it. If there are any other, who do you recommend for a bathymetric survey? So for the bathymetric survey I showed you before, Jim Amberger did that. Jim Amberger also did the survey, the colorful survey I was showing you with the Gulf Beach setback variance. Of course, there are other reputable surveyors in town, but Jim really seems to understand waterfront property issues, is very detailed, and understands what the city and the county are looking for as far as setback lines, vegetation, and things like that. Are there other questions? Oh, information on the waterfront designation. Yes, I saw Brian on this call. He'll probably kill me for not responding. I've worked on an outline and we'll be working on that. The initial presentation will be very similar to this one. And then we will also have some other follow-up ones. We'll probably work with an appraiser to just kind of dig in deeper into some of those 50% rule questions that, you know, really get outside of just the legal aspect and get more into kind of what do numbers look like? Are there contractors out there who are really specialized in this? A question on when the new FEMA maps are coming out. So the new FEMA maps are at least proposed, and on the FEMA website, the one that that I showed you, if I can skip back here towards the beginning of the PowerPoint. When you pull this up, there will also be an option to see proposed flood maps, so you can see at least if the property that you're looking at will remain in a flood zone, will be outside a flood zone, or will become in a flood zone. When I spoke with the county and the city last week, they do not have an answer, and I would imagine that we are at least several months away, again, because FEMA has been so inundated with COVID-related things that the flood maps have kind of been put on hold. We're getting a question to copy and paste. I don't know if I can do that from here. So I certainly will send out this slide at the very least and ask that this be shared with anybody as far as where to direct your questions. Because I'm in presentation mode, I can't copy and paste it right now. There is a question here about how to determine the property line relative to the mean high water line, for example, in beachfront property. I was just looking at one of these recently out on the town of Longboat Key. So there are a couple ways that the legal description can read to determine, you know, what your property line actually is. If you have a platted lot, that property line is defined by the lot line. So even if there's been some erosion and the beach has moved up a lot and you maybe have a smaller amount of upland area, then your property will still be defined by that lot line. However, if you have a typical, what's called a meets and bounds legal description, so it's not a platted lot, oftentimes that legal description will include in it as one of the boundaries. So the waterfront boundary, for example, the mean high water line, and you really need a surveyor out there to determine where the mean high water line is and give you an idea of, you know, what your square footage actually looks like for your beachfront lot. So it is determined by whether or not it is platted or meets and bounds, and then you need a surveyor to help you determine that. Where that came up and why we were looking at that, out on Longboat Key, we were trying to figure out how much more kind of wiggle room a buyer had to add on to property. And there is a certain building coverage that's allowed. So say it was 35% of the entire lot could be covered with property. we needed to determine, what kind of square footage were we working with? Were we working with a platted lot where our square footage was determined, or were we working with some erosion issues because it was a meets and bounds legal description, and we actually didn't have as much square footage as we thought? So that is where some of those questions can come up. Question on whether on the FEMA website you're able to enter an address to find the flood zone status. Yes, you enter the address directly into there, and then you should be able to zoom in on your property and determine which flood zone that you are in. There's a question about whether bathymetric surveys need to be updated, and the answer to that is yes, because seagrasses can grow. Or can disappear, and so figuring out whether or not seagrasses are there could actually be beneficial to your buyer, and the county might require it anyway. So if it's to your favor that the restrictive covenant gives you a boat draft and you like it, that's great. If you think there's a chance that maybe the seagrasses are lower for some reason now, you may want to get a new one. I will tell you that the county is really strict about when the measurement of seagrasses and the bathymetric surveys will be considered kind of valid, because seagrasses grow most in the summer months, like between May and August is really when the county will want to redo bathymetric surveys from their perspective, because when the water's colder, the seagrasses aren't growing as much. Let's see. Candace, you're asking about Jim's contact information. His name is Jim Amberger, Amberger. I'm trying to remember I just don't want to go into my email right now while I'm sharing my screen. I think it's burgertime@yahoo.com, but I'll look into that. If you want to email me at echristy@shumaker.com, I will send you that information. I think that we are running out of time, so I am going to wrap up here. Would love to answer more questions. My phone number again was at the beginning of the slide, and I'll put it in the chat, and my email address. And would just love to chat with you. If you have questions or if there's things that I could help you dig into deeper, please let me know.